So free range is about providing a choice of environments to chickens. But are there things we can do to help them make choices based on what's good for their welfare and that aligns with consumer expectations? Our research over the past 4 years suggests there is, and today let me show you. But first, I'd like to recognise that I'm giving this webinar from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri peoples from the Kulin Nation. And I also recognise the traditional owners of the countries where you're joining from today and the First Nations people present in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Wominjenka, welcome. So we've been looking at optimising range use. We're not maximising range use. We're not trying to push every bird out on the range. Not every bird wants to range. And the idea isn't to scare them out. It's about optimising environments to encourage birds to range. So why do we want to do that? Well, we know that range use and chicken meat welfare are positively related. We've got quite a few publications. Here are a couple that have shown relationships between cardiovascular function, leg health, reduced physiological stress responses after range use. And so we know that there are benefits to accessing the range and accessing it frequently. We also know of consumer perceptions and expectations of free range. It's not simply enough to give chickens a choice of accessing an outdoor range. It's really important for consumers that their chicken that they've purchased has utilised that range area. But range use is highly variable, and we have shown this in a variety of conditions, in a variety of ways, that not every chicken will access the range when it's given the opportunity. And of course, that's season dependent, but it's also just up to some individuals. Some individuals don't want to go out to the range, and some absolutely love it. And those that do actually go out to the range, the majority of those birds do stay close to the shed. And we know there's benefits to welfare and the environment from getting birds to range further from the shed. So that's why we've been looking at optimising ranging behaviour for the past 4 years. And this is the final report that we've put together. It's a short little snapshot. There's more publications around this, and that's available on the AgriFutures Chicken Meat website. But what we found was we were able to identify the optimal distribution of artificial structures on the outdoor range that optimised range use. We designed effective rearing environments that optimised range use. We were able to compare the rearing and the range interventions to rank the most effective method to optimise range use. And we developed a proof of concept for automatic monitoring of range use by machine vision technology. So I'm going to start with the range. What did we see? Now, this component was run by myself in Queensland and also Dr. Carolyn de Koning in South Australia. It was a massive part with this huge amount of work. So, of course, it was across 2 states, South Australia and Queensland, across 2 universities. We had the involvement of 2 integrators and 2 breeds. Of course, all of these are confounded, but we were able to capture a lot of that variability. We looked at ranging behaviour and resources out on the range across 3 farms, 14 flocks, 4 seasons. We did 25,000 counts of chickens on the range at 25,000 time points. And out of those, at 15,000 of those, we actually monitored what every chicken was doing on the range. So it was a huge achievement, but not without its challenges. Of course, we had COVID during this time. We had floods, and halfway through, one of our fantastic producers had an exciting opportunity to move on, fantastic, but we did lose one of those farms. So a few challenges. We've had a huge data set, but there are some holes in there. So we've got a great statistician, Jessica Tan, who was able to help us manage those. So what were we looking at? We know that structures out on the range will actually help encourage birds out on the range. We designed these structures based on the literature. So we know that vertical panels has a positive effect on ranging and laying hens. And so we had these little windbreaks or vertical panels with an idea to encourage range use. We know that chickens prefer lower resources. So we had it low at the front, but producers need to be able to get under there. So we had it higher at the back. So we weren't specifically looking at these characteristics. Rather, we're asking the question, if you've got artificial structures on the range, what is the best orientation to encourage range use? So we can see here, this is our horizontal orientation, where we had a short distance between the shelters close to the shed and those going further out, but a greater distance between them running alongside the shed. Conversely, we had a vertical orientation where it was a shorter distance, they were more consistent along the side of the shed, but a greater space between there going out further from the range. We also looked at a line orientation out into the range, and we had a control with no artificial structures. That was our key finding. Like all good scientists, I'm going to say, well, it depends. The optimal orientation of resources depends on the state, breed and management. We found big differences between Queensland and South Australia. And of course, those things are confounded, so we can't say what that is. We also found differences of the orientation on the side of the shed, that it's the direction that it's facing, season and climate variables. So this is a lot of data to look into, and I do recommend looking into the report if this is something you're interested in, because there's a lot of information here and a lot of details. But in Queensland, what I'm presenting here are the factors that we put into the regression that showed to have a significant impact on ranging and our estimated marginal means. So we can look that the control with no resources was lower. There was more birds on the range when a horizontal and vertical structure was present. We see this big impact of season, so autumn being the most preferred climate for ranging in Queensland. Of course, we had those floods and wet ranges in winter. And the only climate variable that we could see was associated with range use in Queensland was wind speed. So the higher the wind speed, the less birds on the range. But what we did see, which was quite interesting, is this interaction between the orientation of the structures and also which direction the range was facing. So what we see is that there was a negative relationship between horizontal and the west side of the range in Queensland. So we would suggest having the horizontal structures on the east side and the vertical structures on the west side if you're in Queensland. In South Australia, we saw less ranging, but we still saw that impact of having structures on the range. We saw, again, autumn being a preferred ranging season. And we saw a lot more climate variables having an impact. So less birds on the range with lower temperatures, more birds on the range with higher temperatures. And importantly, we've quantified this relationship with UV index and range use. So if you're a free range producer, that's probably a bit of a no-brainer. We know that chickens prefer to range on those nice cloudy days when UV index is low, but that might not be that apparent to consumers. So a beautiful, bright, sunny day, why aren't there chickens on the range? So important that we do actually quantify this. And of course, we saw these relationships between the direction that the range was facing and the orientation of the structures. When we talk about these relationships, and of course we need a lot longer than we've got today to really unpack these and understand them, when we look at these relationships with climate, we also need to understand maybe some of the conditions. So these are extremely wet ranges. We actually didn't quantify range use in this time because it was a bit of an anomaly. But the other thing to note is that we only looked at climate variables when the potholes were open. So when it's extremely hot and the summer in the middle of the day in South Australia, the birds aren't given range access to prevent heat stress for the birds inside. So what we can see is maybe we're not seeing some of these climate relationships in Queensland, because we can see when they're given range access, UV index is quite low relative to what we see in South Australia. So what were they doing out on the range? And what's the potential mechanism here? So this is why it's important for us to look at behaviour. And we looked at behaviour in areas that had no structures, in the horizontal and the vertical areas. And as you can see, we looked underneath the structure here, but also what they were doing adjacent to that structure. There's a lot here, so you don't need to understand all of it. Basically, what we're showing is the various behaviours, so foraging, resting, locomotion, running, preening. We actually saw perching on these vertical structures, but only in Queensland. But I think that the take-home I'd like you to get from this is when we compare no resources compared to resources, we see that when you provide artificial structures and related to the orientation, these birds are more likely to rest. So it may not be that we're encouraging birds to go out onto the range, but maybe what the mechanism is that we're encouraging them to stay on the range. And you can see that resting behaviour here. And we see the same results in South Australia. Okay, there's a lot more there. If you're interested, please do reach out. But in the interest of time, I'd like to share what we found in regards to interventions in the rearing environment. So we started this investigation looking at relationships in a controlled setting. So we used the free-range facility at the University of New England, and we had 3 treatment groups. So we had our control birds, and we gave visual access to the range to another treatment group. So this was a transparent perspex pop hole that birds could see out into the range from day one. Getting them to prepare to range was the theory. We then also had an environmental complexity treatment. And this treatment was based on the scientific literature, but also after some great conversations from free-range producers who had some really great innovative ideas about how we could incorporate things like novelty, which we know has an impact on chicken behaviour, in a practical way, like putting streamers on fans. We know fans go on and off in commercial sheds. Could we capitalise that by putting streamers on there? So there's changes in sound, there's visual changes. We also listened that we know that hay bales can be really effective at altering meat chicken behaviour, but that also there are some concerns around biosecurity. So we made an artificial hay bale. We also then used vertical panels to block certain parts of the environment. And this isn't new for meat chickens. INRA Estevez has been doing this for many years, looking at the implications of these vertical panels on the spatial distribution of meat chickens. But we're the first to look at those in a free-range setting. So this was our complex environment. So what did we find? Did we prepare the birds to range? Well, yes, we did in one of our treatment groups. What this graph is showing here is the proportion of birds that didn't range. So, of course, at day 0, when they haven't had range access, 100% of all of our treatment groups hadn't ranged. And then as we move along with days after they were given the opportunity, we can see the proportion of birds that started to use the range and how long it took them. And this orange line here is our visual access birds. So we see that on day 1, 60% of those birds had actually gone out and utilised the range. And by the end of the experiment, more of those birds had accessed the range and were quicker to do so than our control group. And the slowest and the least amount of range use was actually by our environmental complexity group. So quite not what we're expecting at all. Perhaps we created an environment that they preferred indoors. We also see that those birds that were given visual access spent more days, or accessed the range more days, and spent more time on the range. So to see if this was commercially relevant, we worked with our wonderful producers in Queensland who led us onto their farm and their home, and the wonderful stock people there who allowed us and helped us to make some modifications in the shed. And you can see this here. We had 12 pens that held about 900 chickens per pen, and they were given visual access, as you can see, with the transparent pop holes or not. We also paired with those treatments the preferred orientation of outdoor structures and the least preferred. So we wanted to sort of see here, was there a bigger impact of the rearing treatment or the desired range treatment? And it was quite clear, our results. What we see here is the number of birds on the range, on average at a particular point in a particular area, and the age of the birds. So on the first day they were given range access, we can see the 2 treatment groups that were given visual access to the outdoor range, which is the orange and the grey dotted lines. Significantly more birds were out on the range compared to those that were not given visual access. And as we see over time, range use increases. This is consistent with the literature. But those control birds never caught up. What we do see is close to first pickup, and you can see with the pens in the shed why we didn't go longer than first pickup, that there started to be an impact of what was out on the range. So potentially that mechanism of preparing the birds to go out to range through the rearing environment and then keeping the birds out for longer in the preferred environment. Of course, that's not the whole story. We did find that birds that were given visual access grew slower. So no difference in body weight at 7 or 14 days of age, but at 21 days of age, we saw reduced body weight in both females and males for birds that were given visual access. So what does this mean? We don't know if it's sustained. We don't know potentially what the mechanism is there, but certainly something we need to consider when we're talking about implementing any of these treatments. And finally, I want to take you on to the last part of this project, and you'll probably be very well aware of Cheryl McCarthy, and she's been winning amazing AgriFutures awards for her development of technology. And this is another example of what she was able to do. With relatively cheap mobile phones, she was able to quantify range use. And from someone who counts chickens a lot, spends a lot of their time, it's this incredible technology. And what's probably even more impressive, she wasn't just able to count the number of chickens, she was able to do it in a variety of conditions. So what we can see here is a nice cloudy day where they're quite visually obvious, but also in bright sunny days. And as we can see that even in one picture where you've got a shadow cast from the silos, there's difficulties in extracting that data. But she was able to do this through a variety of methods. And what we see with her output is what we would expect with chicken behaviour. So when it's nice and overcast and we see a lot of chickens out on the range, when it's really sunny, we see fewer. And then when there's a bit of shade provided, that buffers that ranging behaviour somewhat. So from this project, we were able to show that visual access to an outdoor range during rearing does increase range use. And to arrange structures in a specific orientation, depending on the location and the side of the shed, to increase time spent on the range. And that machine vision technology can quantify range use in a variety of environments. But there is more. And so we wanted to look at mechanisms as well as the implications for welfare on some of these treatments. And so we are publishing all of this data. If you're interested, please do reach out. Here's our most recent publication. But we also looked at cognition, so we can see these behavioural assessments of cognition. We're currently processing the brains and gene expression with collaborators at Deakin University. We looked at fearfulness. We looked at mood, specifically anxiety, with an attention bias test. We looked at physiological stress and some really exciting novel indicators too. So we took the classic fecal corticosterone, but we also looked at telomere length. And this was a collaboration with Janja Surovic from University of Vienna, who has been looking into the length of telomeres as an indicator of accumulative stress over lifetime. So a really exciting component of this project to look at some traditional welfare indicators with some new ones and gene expression within the brain. We were also able to look at behaviour. Specifically, we were looking at activity via the use of accelerometers. So people have used accelerometers with chickens before, but this is the first time in a free-range environment. We looked at leg health. We had a wonderful honours student, Natalie Mendes, who looked at leg health through bone-breaking strength, thermal images to look at foot pad dermatitis and hockburn. She looked at behavioural indicators with latency to lie, and this beautiful CT scans of the bones. We also looked at ascites index. And finally, we were given an opportunity to look at relationships between our treatment and range use and meat quality. So there's a huge amount of work here, and it's just a very, very short period of time to be able to tell you about it. Please do reach out. But also I need to acknowledge the huge amount of people who have contributed to this. So of course my colleagues who are project investigators, Jean-Louis Rolt, Carolyn DeConey and Cheryl McCarthy. Of course, AgriFutures, who funded the research. We had wonderful industry partners, Inghams and Bayarda, who worked with us to collect this commercially relevant data. And Andrew Walsh from Inghams. If you're in chickens, you know nothing happens without Andrew Walsh. So across multiple experiments, he was able to facilitate the research. He also sat on our working group panel along with Janine Martel from Bayarda. We had Sheridan and, of course, the AgriFutures teams who, at the start, Kylie Hewson and Georgie Townsend, and through the latter half was Sarika Pandya. We had an amazing group at the University of New England, so Richard Flavel helping us with the leg strength here. The wonderful CART staff from UNE, they're always working, so that's why I could only get a photo like this. Hayley Herriot in particular made a lot of these experiments happen. Manisha Kolak-Shire Party and the whole meat science team at the University of New England. Dominique Blanche from University of WA, who does our corticosterone analysis. The wonderful team at QWASP, including Scotty and Hugh, and also Joe, who's not shown here, who came up and helped us put in these transparent pop holes. And within a couple of days, because the team we had flying up got COVID, we all know this story, but they were absolutely phenomenal. Lara Fanning, who does lab work from drying and grinding poo to ascites index to watching chicken behaviour. We had quite a few master students on this project, including Bilal Ahmed, Jessica Tan or Jolie from Sadi, who was our stats guru and saved a lot of our projects. Farsila and Peter McGilchrist from UNE and New South Wales DPI, who were our meat quality gurus. And just before I left UNE, just after I left UNE and before I started working at Melbourne Uni, I had a lot of these project experiments to run with no assistance. And so my dad stepped in and helped me with a lot of these things. So I'd like to acknowledge Neville Taylor. And of course, our wonderful producers who again led us onto their farms, which are their homes, and really taught us a lot about ranging. It's a beautiful photo to show just that. So thanks for the opportunity to share these results with you today.